I remember the exact moment I decided to leave everything behind. It wasn't a sudden outburst or a fit of rage. It was a quiet, precise realization, the kind that changes your life without fanfare. My name is Elena Ward, and for 66 years I lived for everyone but myself. The day I hung up the phone with my cousin Marilyn, I knew that chapter was over. "Come whenever you're ready," she had said softly. "There's a room waiting for you, no questions asked." When the line went dead, I felt something shift inside me. The air in my hospital room seemed lighter, the walls less suffocating. It was as if that single call had granted me permission to breathe again. I wasn't just planning a visit, I was buying a one-way ticket to freedom. Sunday arrived faster than I expected. I woke before dawn, the sterile light of the hospital monitors glowing like small stars. My stomach twisted with a strange blend of fear and excitement. It was my last morning as their mother, Ethan and Samuel, my sons. By tomorrow, I would simply be Elena, a woman unbound, a woman finally living her own story. Faye, the young nurse who had been so kind to me during my stay, noticed my restless movements. "You look tense today, Mrs. Ward," she said as she checked my pulse. "Not tense, sweetheart. Just ready," I replied with a faint smile. Today is the end of one life and the beginning of another. I had planned every detail meticulously. Lydia, my oldest friend, had withdrawn my savings, $8,000 from the bank, and kept it safe at her house. Faye's sister, a lawyer named Nora, had prepared the documents giving Lydia power of attorney to handle all my legal matters once I was gone. Marilyn was waiting for me in Dallas with open arms and a spare room. Everything was aligned, every piece in place. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ethan and Samuel arrived, as they had promised. Their timing was perfect, their smiles rehearsed. After them came Clara, Samuel's wife, wearing a coral dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. Mara, Ethan's partner, showed up 15 minutes late, apologizing for an urgent work call. "Mom, you look so much better," Ethan said, sitting in the chair farthest from my bed. "The doctor said you might be discharged soon." "Yes," Mara chimed in quickly. "We knew it couldn't be as serious as they said. You've always been strong, strong." As if my strength excused their absence when I'd nearly died. Clara crossed her legs and smiled that polished smile of hers. "So, what are your plans once you leave the hospital? You'll understand it'll be hard for us to visit often with our schedules, but we'll call on weekends." I bit back a bitter laugh. "Call me on weekends if they had nothing better to do." Samuel cleared his throat. "Actually, Mom, we've been talking, and we thought maybe it'd be good for you to consider one of those senior living communities. You know, with nurses and activities and everything, a nursing home. They wanted to tuck me away neatly, like clutter they didn't have the heart to throw out." Clara brightened. "We visited one last week. It's lovely, clean, safe, and not too expensive. About $2,000 a month. Between your pension and a little help from us, it's doable. $2,000 a month, the same as her designer dress for her last birthday." Ethan leaned forward, eager to justify it all. "You'd be surrounded by people your age. Friends, games, all sorts of things. It'd be so much better than being alone." They weren't asking for my opinion. They were announcing a decision, my future, determined in their afternoon meeting. Mara added with professional detachment, "And it'd be safer for everyone. If you have another medical issue, there'd be staff there. You know, so none of us have to miss work or other commitments." There it was, the naked truth. They wanted the peace of mind of knowing that if I died again, it wouldn't interfere with their dinner plans. I surprised myself with how calm my voice sounded. "And when do you plan to do this?" "Oh, no rush," Samuel replied. "Maybe in 2 or 3 months. That'll give you time to adjust. 2 or 3 months, the time they were granting me to prepare for my exile. You know what?" I said finally, feeling a smile curl at the edge of my lips. "You're right. I think a change would do me good." Relief washed over their faces. "They mistook my surrender for agreement. I'm glad you see it that way, Mom," Ethan said. "It'll be better for everyone." "Yes," I replied softly. "Better for everyone." They spent the next hour talking about themselves, vacations, work projects, the latest restaurants they'd tried. I was a silent spectator, invisible in my own story. Clara pulled out her phone to show Mara photos of her birthday cake. $300, she boasted. Worth every penny, a quarter of my monthly grocery budget. Then the dress. $1,200, she said proudly. But I deserve it. Yes, she deserved a dress. I didn't deserve a visit when I almost died. By 4 o'clock, they began their farewell rituals. Mara checked her watch. Clara yawned. Samuel glanced at his phone. "Well, Mom," Ethan said, standing. "We should get going. Dinner with Mara's parents tonight." "Of course," I said. "Go in peace." Each gave me a perfunctory kiss on the forehead. Clara even wiped her lips afterward. "We'll call this week," Samuel promised. "Take good care of yourself," Clara added. "We'll handle everything." They left behind the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of empty promises. I stared at the closed door and whispered to the silence, "Goodbye." A few minutes later, Lydia would arrive. In a few hours, I would be gone. By morning, this hospital bed would be empty, and my children would be reading a letter that would rewrite their lives. When Faye returned for the evening check, she smiled at me. "How do you feel after their visit, Mrs. Ward?" I looked at her, my voice steady. "Free, Faye. For the first time in decades, I feel free." "Free from what?" she asked. "From the illusion that I matter to anyone but myself." That night, I watched the clock tick toward 6, waiting for Lydia's arrival. Every tick sounded like the countdown to my rebirth. The hallway outside my room was dim when Lydia appeared, her footsteps light but sure. She was dressed simply, in her usual cardigan and long skirt, her silver hair pinned neatly. To anyone else, she would look like a woman visiting a sick friend. To me, she was my co-conspirator, my anchor. "Elena," she whispered as she closed the door gently behind her. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." She sat beside my bed, her eyes kind but serious. "Everything's set. I signed the papers with Nora this morning. Your account has been closed and the cash is in your bag. Marilyn's expecting you before dawn." I reached for her hand, my heart trembling with gratitude. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has, Lydia." She squeezed my fingers. "You've done enough for others your whole life. It's time someone did something for you." I looked around the room one last time. The bland walls, the humming machines, the scent of disinfectant. I'd spent weeks here, watching the ceiling tiles like they held answers. Now it all seemed so small, so temporary. "What about the doctor?" I asked. "Will anyone notice I'm gone?" Lydia shook her head. "Faye's covering for you. She'll mark you down as transferred for specialized home recovery. By the time they realize the truth, you'll be long gone." The plan had been simple, elegant even. Lydia would drive me out of the city under the guise of a late-night transfer. Faye would file the paperwork. Nora would make sure my medical records aligned with the story. And by the time morning came, Elena Ward would be a missing person no one had the time or perhaps the desire to find. "Let's go." "Then," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lydia helped me dress, comfortable trousers, a soft blouse, and the old cardigan Marilyn had sent me years ago. When she opened my hospital drawer, she found the sealed envelope I had left there earlier that day. "My letter. You're sure about this?" she asked. "Yes, they'll find it tomorrow." She nodded, slid the envelope into her purse, and took my arm. I leaned on her as we made our way down the quiet hallway. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and night. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the exhilarating taste of escape. We slipped through the side exit near the ambulance bay. The security guard barely glanced our way. Lydia's confident stride made us invisible. Outside, the cold air hit me like a shock, pure and bracing. Her car waited under the flickering light of a lamppost, a small, aging sedan with a comforting hum when she turned the key. "Where to first?" she asked. "Home," I said. Just for a moment. The drive through the city was surreal. Streetlights blurred past, each one marking a step farther from the life I'd known. I watched the familiar landmarks fade into darkness. The grocery store where I used to buy their favorite cereal. The cafe where I once waited for hours for Samuel's call that never came. When we reached my house, Lydia parked down the street. I stared at the front door, my heart heavy but resolute. "You don't have to go in," Lydia said softly. "I do." I stepped out, my legs trembling from the long weeks in bed. The front porch creaked under my weight. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of disuse. I turned on the lamp by the entryway, the same one I'd bought after my husband Richard died. Its soft yellow glow bathed the room in melancholy warmth. The house looked exactly as I'd left it, neat, orderly, waiting. The photo of Ethan and Samuel as boys still sat on the mantel. Their gap-toothed grins stared back at me, oblivious to what they'd become. I walked to my writing desk and placed another envelope beside the lamp. This one was for them, a letter I'd rewritten a dozen times, every word carefully chosen. Not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. When Lydia joined me inside, she looked around quietly. "You could still change your mind, you know. Start fresh here, maybe sell the house, move somewhere nearby." I smiled faintly. "If I stay here, I'll still be waiting for them to remember I exist. I can't do that anymore." She nodded, understanding what I didn't say. Before leaving, I walked into the kitchen. The same old clock ticked on the wall, its sound steady and patient. I poured myself a glass of water, savoring the simple act as if it were sacred. Then I turned off the light and whispered, "Goodbye." Outside, Lydia opened the trunk to reveal a single suitcase. Mine. Everything I needed was inside: clothes, documents, a few photographs, and the money. We drove in silence for a long time, heading south toward the highway. The city lights faded behind us until they were just a dull glow in the distance. At one point, Lydia spoke softly. "You know, they'll say you abandoned them." "I know," I said. "But in truth, they abandoned me years ago." We fell into a long silence after that. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of silver beneath the moonlight. By the time we reached Lydia's farmhouse outside the city, the clock on the dashboard read nearly midnight. She helped me inside and made tea, her movements gentle and unhurried. "Stay here until morning," she said. "Then take the early train to Dallas. Marilyn will meet you at the station." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me. "And you'll handle everything else?" "Everything," she promised. "Your bills, your accounts, the deed. By the time they come looking, there'll be nothing left to trace." I wanted to thank her, but the words caught in my throat. She seemed to understand anyway. Later, as I lay in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint hum of the world outside. The crickets, the wind brushing against the window, the sound of a dog barking in the distance. It was the first time in years I felt at peace. Somewhere, in a hospital miles away, a nurse named Faye was marking my file as transferred. Somewhere else, my sons were raising glasses at dinner, laughing, unaware that they had already lost me. I smiled faintly, turning on my side. For the first time, the future didn't frighten me. It called to me. And though I didn't yet know what awaited in Dallas, I knew one thing for certain. The woman I'd been, the obedient mother, the forgotten widow, was gone. By dawn, only Elena Ward's shadow would remain. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Lydia's guest room, soft and gray, carrying that faint chill of early autumn. I woke with the strange sensation that I had already crossed an invisible line, that everything I'd been before belonged to someone else. My chest still ached, but it wasn't the sharp pain of illness anymore. It was something deeper, like the soreness that follows freedom. When I walked into the kitchen, Lydia was already there, humming softly as she poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs. The smell of toasted bread and chamomile filled the air. "You slept well," she said without turning around. "Better than I have in years," I admitted, easing myself into the chair. "It feels quiet, not empty, just quiet." "That's what peace sounds like," Lydia replied, setting the mug before me. "Most people don't recognize it when they finally find it." We ate in silence for a while, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Then Lydia reached into her pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "It's your ticket," she said. "The 9:20 train to Dallas, 1 transfer in Memphis. Marilyn will be waiting at Union Station with your name on a small sign, EW, just like we planned." I touched the paper like it was sacred. My whole new life was contained in that small rectangle, printed ink, time, and direction. Lydia studied me for a long moment. "You're not scared?" "I'm terrified," I said honestly, "but it's a different kind of fear. Not the kind that keeps you frozen. The kind that tells you you're finally doing something right. She smiled, her eyes soft. Good. That's the kind worth listening to. I left the farmhouse just after 8. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue streaked with pink. Lydia drove me to the station, both of us quiet. When we pulled up to the small brick building that smelled faintly of diesel and coffee, I turned to her. Promise me you'll burn the letters after they're delivered, I said. I will, she said. And Elena, if you ever decide to come back, you'll always have a place here. I reached for her hand. You've already given me one. The world feels bigger now because of you. We hugged tightly, and then I walked away before either of us could say another word. The platform was nearly empty. A man with a worn hat read a newspaper, and a young couple whispered about their honeymoon plans. I felt invisible among them, like a ghost slipping between lives. When the train finally arrived, its metallic groan filled the air, and I stepped aboard without looking back. Inside, the carriage smelled of coffee, old upholstery, and anticipation. I found my seat by the window and pressed my forehead to the cool glass. As the train began to move, the countryside blurred into motion, fields, barns, and winding roads fading into memory. For a long time, I didn't think of my sons. I thought of the girl I once was, the one who loved books, the one who dreamed of traveling, the one who painted landscapes she never had the courage to show anyone. Somewhere along the way, I'd buried her under laundry, grocery lists, and expectations. Now, with every mile, I felt her stirring back to life. When the conductor came by to check tickets, he gave me a polite smile. Dallas, ma'am? That's a long way. Yes, I said, returning his smile faintly, but worth it. I spent the next few hours watching the land change outside my window, the flat fields giving way to rolling hills, the small towns blurring past with their sleepy gas stations and faded billboards. Somewhere along the way, I dozed off. I dreamt of a kitchen filled with laughter, of small hands reaching for mine. Then the laughter grew distant, replaced by the sound of rain. When I woke, the sun had shifted, and we were pulling into Memphis. During the transfer, I sat in the terminal cafe, sipping weak coffee and eating a dry sandwich. I could hear snippets of conversation from nearby tables, families talking about reunions, students discussing classes, lovers whispering plans. Every word was like an echo from a life I used to know. "Excuse me," said a voice, pulling me back. A man, maybe in his 70s, stood beside my table. His suit was old but neatly pressed, his eyes bright beneath thick glasses. "May I sit?" "The other tables are full," I nodded. "Of course." He smiled and took a seat. "Traveling far?" "Dallas." "Ah, my late wife and I used to visit every winter. She loved the old markets there." He paused, studying me. "Starting fresh?" The question startled me. "Why would you say that?" He chuckled softly. "You have that look. People who leave, they always do. Like they're walking away from a fire they lit themselves." I didn't respond. I couldn't. He didn't pry further. We sat quietly until his train was called. Before leaving, he said, "Whatever you're running from, I hope you find something better waiting." I watched him walk away, the echo of his words lingering long after he disappeared into the crowd. When my train was called, I boarded again, heart pounding. The rest of the journey blurred into a haze of movement and memory. I thought of my sons, Ethan with his polite distance, always too busy to call. Samuel, so practical and proud, his wife's voice always filtering his words before they reached me. I wondered if they'd read my letter yet. I wondered if they'd cried, but then I reminded myself that part of my life was over. By the time we reached Dallas, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. The city unfolded before me, vast, humming, alive. When I stepped off the train, the air was warm and smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. People bustled everywhere, their voices overlapping in 100 different rhythms. For a moment, I felt dizzy with it all, the noise, the colors, the freedom, and then I saw her. Marilyn stood near the exit, holding a small sign that read EW. She was shorter than I remembered, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun, her face still carrying that quiet strength I'd always admired. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Elena," she said, her voice breaking as she pulled me into her arms. "You're really here. I told you I'd come, I whispered. She held me tighter. You're safe now. Come home. Home. The word felt strange, like a forgotten song. As we walked out of the station into the cooling evening, I looked back once, not at the train, not at the crowd, but at the sky itself. For the first time in my life, I had no one to answer to, no one to please, no one to disappoint. And in that silence, something beautiful bloomed inside me. Freedom didn't feel like flight. It felt like stillness. The drive from the station to Marilyn's house felt like crossing into another life. The city outside the window was bright, full of motion. People walking dogs, neon signs flickering, cafes spilling laughter onto the sidewalks. I watched it all as though I were seeing the world for the first time. Marilyn kept glancing at me, smiling in that patient way she had. You're quiet, she said as we stopped at a light. I'm absorbing, I replied, unsure of how to explain the strange calm pulsing through me. Everything feels new, like the colors are brighter here. She chuckled softly. That's what happens when you leave behind everything that was dimming your light. We turned into a quiet residential street lined with trees. Her house was small but full of character. A white fence, blue shutters, a garden bursting with roses and marigolds. The air smelled of earth and rain. Welcome home, Marilyn said, unlocking the door. Inside, the house radiated warmth. There were shelves filled with books, framed photos of smiling faces I didn't know, and a cat sleeping lazily on the couch. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. I prepared the guest room for you, she said, leading me down a short hallway. The room was painted a soft yellow, with lace curtains and a handmade quilt on the bed. A vase of fresh daisies sat by the window. It's beautiful, I whispered, my throat tightening. I wanted you to feel safe. You've been through enough uncertainty. I sat on the bed, running my hand over the quilt. Safe, I repeated softly. I don't even remember the last time I felt that. She smiled, sitting beside me. You will again, and soon it'll feel natural. That night, after unpacking my small suitcase, I stood by the window and looked out into the garden. The moonlight fell on the flowers, turning them silver. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for a phone call, a visit, an apology that would never come. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It healed. The next morning I woke early. Marilyn was already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. Sleep well? She asked. Like a child, I said. A child who doesn't owe anyone an explanation, she laughed. That's the spirit. Over breakfast, she told me about her neighborhood, how the women gathered every Tuesday in the park for yoga, how the library hosted poetry readings on Fridays, how there was a community center looking for volunteers. There's a whole life waiting for you here, Elena. You just have to step into it. After we cleaned up, she handed me a small notebook. A fresh start deserves a fresh story, she said. Write whatever you want. Dreams, plans, grocery lists. Just start writing again. I took it carefully, as if she were giving me something sacred. You remembered I used to write. I never forget the things that make people come alive. That afternoon, I joined her on a walk through the neighborhood. The air was warm and carried the scent of jasmine. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalks, their laughter echoing in the distance. Do you miss them? Marilyn asked gently, though I knew she didn't need to specify who them was. I paused. Not in the way I thought I would, I said finally. I miss the version of them that loved me before they learned to treat me like a responsibility. But that version died long ago, Marilyn nodded. And now? Now I miss myself less. That's progress. We walked in silence for a while. There was something soothing in the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, in the way the trees swayed overhead. When we returned home, I found myself opening the notebook she'd given me. The first page stared up at me, empty and full of possibility. For a moment I hesitated. Then I wrote, Day 1. I am learning to belong to myself again. That night, after dinner, Marilyn and I sat in the living room drinking tea. She asked about my past, and I told her small pieces, the heart attack, the loneliness, the way my children's love had turned into something transactional. They used to bring me gifts instead of affection, I said. A new shawl, a gadget I didn't need, things to replace their presence. And I accepted it, because I thought that was what aging gracefully meant. But it wasn't grace. It was resignation. Marilyn reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're not the only one who's felt that way. But you're one of the few who did something about it. Her words lingered in the air long after we'd gone to bed. In the following days, I began to explore small parts of Dallas. I visited the local market where vendors sold peaches that tasted like sunshine, and I wandered through a park filled with elderly couples feeding pigeons. I felt invisible, but in a good way, like the world was giving me space to breathe. Every night, I wrote in the notebook. Not long entries, just small truths. I no longer crave their approval. The silence after dinner feels like peace, not punishment. Maybe freedom isn't a place. Maybe it's the courage to walk away. On the 6th day, as I sat on a bench watching the sunset, a woman approached me. She was about my age, wearing a wide hat and carrying a small dog. Beautiful evening, she said, sitting beside me. It is, I replied. I don't think I've seen you around before. I just moved here. She smiled knowingly. Fresh start? Yes, I said softly. A long time coming. She extended her hand. I'm Nora. We have a small book club that meets on Thursdays. You look like someone who might appreciate good stories. I hesitated, then smiled. I'd love that. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. Today, I was invited into something. I said yes. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel my life stretching open. Mornings with Marilyn, afternoons reading with Nora and her friends, evenings spent cooking simple meals that tasted of contentment. I wasn't the same woman who had left that hospital bed, and yet, sometimes, when the night grew too quiet, I thought about my sons. I imagined them finding my letter, imagined the shock, the confusion, the guilt. But instead of pain, I felt a strange pity for the smallness of their world, for the way they mistook neglect for success. I didn't hate them. I had simply stopped needing them. One morning, I received a letter from Linda, my old neighbor. Inside was a photo of my old street, the house where I'd lived for 40 years. The roses I'd planted were blooming. She wrote, "Your garden misses you, but it's still thriving, just like you said it would." I smiled through tears. The garden was proof, even when left behind. Life continues. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered to the ceiling, I did it. I had crossed the line between existing and living, and for the first time, there was no going back. The weeks that followed unfolded like a quiet miracle. My days were no longer filled with hospital beeps or the hollow silence of unanswered phone calls. Instead, there was laughter, the smell of coffee in the mornings, and the comforting rhythm of a life that finally belonged to me. Every morning I joined Marilyn in the garden. She would be on her knees, tending to the soil with her hands, humming old songs her mother used to sing. I would sit beside her, pruning the roses or simply watching the sunlight dance on the petals. Sometimes we didn't say a word for an hour, and yet it felt like the most honest conversation I'd ever had. "You've got a green thumb," she told me one morning as she stood to stretch her back. I smiled, brushing the dirt from my fingers. "I guess it never left me. I just stopped using it." She looked at me thoughtfully. "You stopped using a lot of things, didn't you?" Her words weren't cruel, they were true. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit into the spaces my children allowed me. I had let my curiosity, my humor, my voice fade until I barely recognized myself. But here, in the warmth of a Dallas morning, those lost pieces of me began to return. One afternoon, Nora invited me to her book club. I almost said no, afraid that I wouldn't fit in, that my story would feel too heavy for their cheerful gatherings. But Marilyn insisted, "You need to be around people who see you, not just your age." So I went. The book club met in a cozy room at the community library. There were 6 women, all around my age or older. They greeted me with genuine smiles and curious eyes. "We're reading The Housekeeper and the Professor," Nora said, handing me a copy. "Have you read it?" "I haven't," I admitted, taking the book. "It's about memory," she said softly, "and how love can survive even when everything else fades." Something in her tone made me pause. "That sounds beautiful." "It is," she replied. It reminds you that even the smallest moments can make a lifetime. We spent 2 hours talking about the story, laughing and sometimes crying. I found myself speaking openly, my voice trembling at first, then growing steady as the others listened. They didn't know about my past, but somehow they understood my silences. Afterward, Nora walked me to the door. "You belong here, Elena," she said. "Don't forget that." That night, I wrote in my notebook. I spoke. They listened. I think I am learning how to be part of the world again. As days turned into weeks, I built a new rhythm. I volunteered twice a week at a small thrift shop, organizing donated clothes. I met people from every walk of life, retirees, single mothers, students. There was something deeply healing about folding shirts, hanging dresses, and chatting with strangers who had no idea who I used to be. One afternoon, as I was arranging scarves by color, a man approached me. He was tall, in his early 70s perhaps, with gray hair and gentle eyes. "Excuse me," he said, holding up a tie. "Do you think this suits me?" I looked him over, smiling. "It depends. Are you wearing it for someone special?" He chuckled. "For myself, mostly. I have dinner with some friends tonight, and I thought I should look decent." "In that case," I said, straightening the tie in his hands, "you'll look more than decent." "That color brings out your eyes," he grinned. "You have a good eye." "Years of experience dressing ungrateful men," I replied, before I could stop myself. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll take it then. And maybe next time you can help me pick a shirt." After he left, I realized I was smiling. It wasn't a romantic smile, just the quiet surprise of realizing someone had seen me, not as a patient or a mother or a burden, but as a woman. That evening, I told Marilyn about him over dinner. "His name?" she asked, teasing. "I didn't ask," I said, laughing. "Maybe next time," she winked. "You're glowing, Elena. It suits you." In truth, I was glowing, not because of him, but because I was beginning to recognize the person in the mirror again. My cheeks had color, my posture had straightened, and my eyes had lost that perpetual tiredness. Weeks later, the man, his name turned out to be Henry, returned to the thrift shop. This time he brought coffee. "For you," he said, handing me a cup. "You looked like you could use a pick-me-up last time." "Thank you," I said, touched by the gesture. He nodded toward the racks. "You seem happy here." "I am," I said simply. "It's quiet, but it's mine." We talked for nearly half an hour. He told me about losing his wife 5 years ago, about how he had spent too much time living in the shadow of what was gone. "I guess I just stopped trying to live," he admitted. "I know that feeling," I said softly. From then on, he became a familiar face, a friend. Sometimes he'd stop by the shop, sometimes we'd meet for coffee in the park. We talked about books, about music, about how difficult it was to forgive ourselves for wasting so much time on people who didn't stay. "Maybe it's not wasted," he said one afternoon. "Maybe it's just life teaching us where not to go again." His words lingered long after he'd gone. That evening, as I sat in my room, I looked around at the small space that now felt like home, the notebook on my desk, the flowers by the window, the quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. I realized then that I hadn't thought about my sons all day. Not once, that realization didn't hurt. It felt like healing. Before bed, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Freedom doesn't come with fireworks. It comes quietly, like the first breath after you stop drowning." When I turned off the light, I lay awake for a long while, listening to the crickets outside. My heart no longer felt heavy with what I'd lost. It was light with what I'd gained, and though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, it would be mine to choose. It's strange how quickly life reshapes itself when you finally stop clinging to what's broken. Within months, my world had shifted from sterile hospital rooms to sunny mornings filled with birdsong and coffee steam curling in the air. I was no longer surviving on memory. I was living in the moment. The community center had become my second home. Nora introduced me to a group of volunteers who helped organize weekend events, potluck dinners, art fairs, charity drives. I started helping with the setup, arranging tables, decorating bulletin boards, even baking occasionally. Each time someone would thank me, and I'd smile, thinking how long it had been since gratitude felt mutual instead of one-sided. One afternoon, during cleanup after a local craft fair, I caught sight of Henry across the room, helping stack chairs. He waved, and I found myself waving back, a small but genuine motion that felt as natural as breathing. Later, as we stepped outside into the golden dusk, he said, "You've changed since I first met you." "Changed?" I teased. "You make it sound dramatic," he smiled. "It is. You used to look like someone who'd built a wall around herself. Now you look like you've started leaving the gate open." I looked away, the comment striking deeper than I expected. Maybe I just got tired of the view from inside. He nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "Whatever it is, it suits you." We walked in silence for a while. The sun hung low, tinting the world in amber. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of endings. That night, Marilyn noticed the change in my mood. "You're smiling more," she said as she stirred her tea. "I think I'm learning to like who I am again," I admitted. She smiled knowingly. About time. Days passed in gentle rhythm. I grew fond of the quiet hours in the morning when Marilyn and I read the newspaper together. She'd hum and make notes on crossword puzzles, and I'd circle articles about places I wanted to visit someday. It wasn't excitement, it was possibility, and that was enough. But one morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet my heart recognized it immediately. It was from Michael, my eldest son. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope for a long time before opening it. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. "Mother, we found your letter weeks after you left. At first we were angry, then confused. I guess we didn't understand why you felt the need to go so far away. But I've been thinking a lot lately about how often we treated you like background noise in our busy lives. You were always there, so we forgot you could disappear. Daniel has been quiet about it. I think he's hurt, though he won't admit it. I am too, not because you left, but because you had to. I hope you're happy. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. No pressure, just, I hope you're safe. Love, Michael." I read it 3 times, each word sinking into me like rain soaking dry soil. There was no apology, not in the way I had once dreamed of. But there was awareness, and that was something I had never expected. Marilyn found me sitting quietly, the letter in my hand. "Bad news?" she asked softly. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not bad, just honest." She poured me tea and sat down. "Are you going to write back?" "I don't know yet," I said truthfully. "Maybe one day, maybe never. For now, I just want to hold on to this feeling of not needing to explain myself anymore." That evening, as I walked through the garden, I thought about how love changes shape. I had spent so many years craving their validation, mistaking it for connection. But now, standing under the open sky, I understood something simple and profound. Love doesn't need to be proven to exist. Sometimes it just needs to be released. Days turned into weeks again. I went back to the thrift shop, helped organize another event at the center, shared meals with Marilyn and Nora, and watched Henry's quiet smile become a familiar comfort. We never spoke about the past. We didn't need to. There was peace in our silences. One afternoon, he invited me to a small cafe by the lake. "There's music on Saturdays," he said. "A local jazz trio. You might like it." I almost declined, instinctively reaching for excuses. But then I remembered how many moments I'd let slip away out of fear. "I'd love to," I said. The cafe was small, tucked near the edge of the water. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting soft glows across the tables. The band played mellow tunes, and for the first time in decades, I let myself sway gently to the rhythm. Henry watched me with a smile. "You really do look happy, you know." "I feel it," I said. "I didn't think I ever would again." He nodded. "That's the best kind of miracle, the quiet ones we don't see coming." When I got home that night, Marilyn was reading in her chair. She looked up and grinned. "You've been gone long enough for me to suspect romance." I laughed, shaking my head. "Just music and coffee." "Music and coffee," she said playfully. "The gateway to everything else." I rolled my eyes, but inside I felt a flicker of warmth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, notebook open, moonlight spilling across the page. I wrote, Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a daily choice. To stop reopening the wound just to check if it still hurts. As the night deepened, I realized I wasn't writing for them anymore. I was writing for me, for the woman who had survived the emptiness and found her way back to herself. A few days later, Nora dropped by with a small gift, a framed quote that read, "You cannot start the next chapter if you keep rereading the last one." I placed it on my nightstand. Every morning since, it's the first thing I see. Time, once a cruel reminder of what I'd lost, now feels like an open field. I don't rush it anymore. I let it stretch, breathe, unfold. Sometimes, I still think about my sons, not with resentment, but with quiet compassion. I hope they find the courage I found, even if it comes late. And sometimes, when the wind carries the scent of jasmine through my window, I whisper into the night, "I forgive you." I forgive me too. For the first time, the words don't feel heavy. They feel like wings. The weeks after Michael's letter brought a quiet steadiness to my life. It felt like the storm inside me had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape both fragile and fertile. I no longer woke up with the heaviness of resentment. Instead, there was a sense of spaciousness, like I'd cleared out a cluttered room and could finally breathe again. Each morning began with ritual. Coffee, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains, and the familiar rustle of Marilyn's slippers in the hallway. She had a way of humming off-key that made the house feel alive. "You're starting to glow again," she said one morning, setting a plate of toast on the table. "Glow?" I chuckled. "At my age, I think the word you're looking for is perspire." She rolled her eyes and smiled. "No, glow. Don't argue. You're lighter these days. There's something in your eyes. Peace, maybe. Peace." That word used to feel impossible, a luxury reserved for people untouched by betrayal. But she was right. I had stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, and in their absence, I'd found something else. Myself. A few days later, I got a call from the community center. They were organizing a storytelling night, and Nora thought I should participate. "You have so many experiences, Cecilia," she said. "People would love to hear them." The idea terrified me at first. Standing in front of strangers, peeling back layers of my life. But then I thought of all the years I had kept silent, swallowing pain, pride, disappointment. Maybe this was my chance to speak, not to accuse, but to reclaim my voice. When the evening arrived, the small auditorium was warm and dimly lit. People filled the seats, murmuring softly. I sat in the second row, heart thudding like a drum. Henry was there too, offering an encouraging nod. When my name was called, I walked to the stage. My hands trembled as I took the microphone. The light was blinding at first, but then I saw faces, kind, open, expectant, and the fear melted away. "I'm going to tell you a story," I began, "about a woman who loved so much that she forgot herself." I told them about the years of sacrifice, of raising 2 sons alone, of choosing duty over dreams. I spoke of laughter that turned to distance, of loneliness disguised as routine, of the night I almost died while they toasted champagne. I didn't name them. I didn't need to. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about rebirth. And then, I said, voice steady now, one day she decided to live for herself. She packed her pain into a letter and walked away, not to punish anyone, but to find out who she was without their expectations. When I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat before warm applause filled the air. A few people had tears in their eyes. Nora hugged me tightly afterward. "You just gave half this room permission to forgive themselves," she whispered. That night, I walked home beneath a velvet sky, stars scattered like promises overhead. I felt lighter than I had in years. The next morning, Marilyn handed me the local paper. "Look," she said, pointing to a photo of me on the community page. "Local woman shares story of courage and renewal." I laughed. "Courage?" I was shaking the whole time, she smiled. "That's what courage looks like, dear. Doing it anyway." Life moved in small, beautiful circles after that. I began volunteering regularly, reading to children at the library, helping at the food pantry, even teaching basic sewing classes. Every face I met reminded me that connection could still bloom, even after the soil had been neglected for so long. Henry and I grew closer too, though neither of us rushed to define what we were. We shared long walks, endless conversations, and a comforting silence that asked for nothing. One afternoon, as we sat by the lake, he said, "You know, Cecilia, I used to think the hardest part of aging was losing people, but now I think it's losing pieces of yourself and trying to get them back." I looked out at the rippling water. "Maybe the trick isn't getting them back," I said softly. "Maybe it's learning to live without them and realizing you're still whole." He smiled. "You're wiser than most," I shook my head. "No, just older and finally listening." Days turned into months. The air grew cooler, leaves shifting from green to amber. With autumn came reflection. Sometimes, while folding laundry or cooking dinner, I'd think of my sons, of Michael's quiet sincerity, of Daniel's nervous laugh when he was small. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a distant ache, like an old scar that only hurts when it rains. Then, one crisp October morning, Marilyn found me sitting by the window with a letter in my hand. "Another one?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "From Daniel this time." She waited silently as I opened it. "Mom, I don't know where you are, but Michael showed me your letter. I can't stop thinking about it. You're right, we took you for granted. I don't know how to fix that, or if I can. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I miss you. Love, Daniel." My chest tightened. There were only a few lines, but they carried years of silence breaking apart. Marilyn touched my shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You made them see." I shook my head, eyes glistening. "No, Marilyn. Life did, time did. I just stopped shielding them from the consequences." That night I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered a small thank you to the universe for letting me live long enough to witness a sliver of redemption. I placed both letters in a box under my bed, beside the first one I had written before leaving. It felt like closing a chapter, not with bitterness, but with grace. Winter crept in slowly. The first frost painted the windows in delicate lace. Marilyn and I spent evenings by the fire, sipping cocoa and laughing at old movies. Sometimes Henry joined us, bringing homemade stew or a bottle of wine. The house, once silent, now echoed with warmth and friendship. One snowy evening, as we decorated a small Christmas tree, Marilyn looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "if you wanted to visit your sons one day, I think it would be okay now." I paused, hanging a silver ornament. "Maybe, but not yet. I'm not ready to return as the woman they remember. I want them to meet the one I've become." She nodded, understanding. That night, as snowflakes drifted outside, I wrote in my journal again. Healing isn't a straight path. It's a circle, sometimes wide, sometimes tight, but always moving toward wholeness. I closed the notebook, feeling a quiet certainty settle in my chest. I wasn't the same woman who had left that hospital room months ago. I was something new, reborn through pain, strengthened by solitude, softened by forgiveness. For the first time, I didn't just believe I could start over. I knew I already had. The new year came quietly, without fanfare or noise, just the soft chime of the clock and the glow of the fireplace. Marilyn and I toasted with apple cider instead of champagne, and when the clock struck midnight, she hugged me and said, "To second chances." "My dear, to second chances," I repeated, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my chest. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how far I'd come. Less than a year ago, I was a woman confined to a hospital bed, convinced that her life had already ended. Now I had friends who loved me, a small but steady routine, and a sense of purpose that grew stronger with every sunrise. In the following weeks, I threw myself into my literature course at the university. Walking into that classroom for the first time had felt strange, like trespassing into a world reserved for youth. But the professor, a soft-spoken man with silver hair, had welcomed me warmly. "You are precisely what literature needs, Mrs. Stone," he said. "A reader who has lived enough to understand the weight of words." I sat beside a group of students young enough to be my grandchildren. At first, they regarded me with polite curiosity, but soon they began to seek me out for discussions. One of them, a bright girl named Lucia, often stayed behind after class. "You remind me of my grandmother," she told me once. "She always said stories save people." "She's right," I said with a smile. "Sometimes stories are the only things that keep us alive." In that classroom, surrounded by books and ideas, I rediscovered something I had buried long ago, the joy of curiosity. I began to write essays, reflections, even small pieces of fiction. The words poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. Each sentence felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost in the name of motherhood, of duty, of survival. Henry was my constant supporter. He'd walk me to class when the weather was nice and wait for me afterward, holding a thermos of hot tea. "Scholar and poet," he teased one afternoon, "you'll be famous before me." "Oh, please," I said, laughing. "At my age, the only thing I'm competing for is the best seat by the window." But beneath the laughter, there was affection, gentle, unhurried, and safe. He never asked too much of me, never pushed. We were two people who had lost enough to understand the value of patience. One evening after class, we stopped at a small cafe. The walls were lined with books, and the smell of coffee and cinnamon wrapped around us like an embrace. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked suddenly. "Back?" I repeated, stirring my tea. "To your old life, your children." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes. Not because I miss the pain, but because I miss the version of me who still believed she was needed. But then I remember, need isn't the same as love." He nodded slowly. "No, it isn't." The conversation lingered with me that night. I didn't want to live in bitterness, but I also didn't want to pretend that forgiveness was easy. It was work, slow, uneven, but necessary. Spring arrived in a burst of color. The garden behind Marilyn's house bloomed wildly, roses and jasmine filling the air with sweetness. On mornings when the sun was gentle, I'd sit outside with my journal, writing letters I would never send. Letters to my younger self, to the woman who waited for phone calls that never came, to the mother who believed her worth was measured by her children's gratitude. One letter began simply, "You were always enough." They just never learned how to see it. In early April, I received another message, this time from Michael. It wasn't a letter, but an email sent through an old account I barely checked anymore. "Mom, I don't know if you'll read this, but I hope you do. Daniel told me he wrote to you and that you got it. We've been talking a lot lately, really talking, for the first time in years. Your letter changed everything between us. We realized we were living on autopilot, chasing success and forgetting the woman who gave us everything. I've started volunteering at a hospice center. Daniel is teaching art at a local school. Maybe this isn't enough to make up for what we did, but it's a start. Wherever you are, I hope you're happy. You deserve that more than anyone. Love, Michael." I reread the message several times, my throat tight with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Maybe, after all, this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic reunion, but a quiet ripple of change in their lives. I didn't reply. Not yet. Sometimes silence says everything words can't. That afternoon, I went to the park and sat under a tree, watching children play. I thought about how life moves in circles, how pain becomes wisdom, how endings turn into beginnings. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you," to no one and everyone at once. A few days later, Nora stopped by the boutique where I worked part-time. "Cecilia," she said, her eyes bright, "we're organizing another storytelling night. People keep asking about you. They want you to read something new." I hesitated. "I don't know if I have anything new." "Of course you do," she said, smiling. "You're living it." So I agreed. On the night of the event, the auditorium was packed again. But this time I wasn't nervous. I stood before the crowd with a calm heart and began reading a story I had written. One about a woman who left home to find peace and, in doing so, taught her children what love truly meant. When I finished, the applause was warm and sustained. Someone asked if it was based on a true story. I smiled and said, "Every story is true if it comes from the heart." Afterward, a young woman approached me. "Your story," she said, "it made me call my mother tonight. We haven't spoken in months." Her words sank deep. That was it. The reason I had survived, the reason I had told my story. So others might heal too. That night, as Henry walked me home, he said, "You know, Cecilia, maybe your journey wasn't about leaving. Maybe it was about becoming." I looked up at the starlit sky and nodded. "Yes, I think you're right. I didn't run away from life. I walked toward it." The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the scent of blooming jasmine. For the first time in decades, I felt no lingering ache, no longing for what was lost. Only gratitude, for pain that taught me, for love that changed me, and for freedom that saved me. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, Marilyn peeked into the kitchen. "You're smiling again," she said. "I know," I replied, feeling the truth of it. "This time it's real." Summer settled over Dallas with a warmth that felt alive, not suffocating. The days stretched long and golden, filled with the hum of cicadas and the scent of jasmine drifting through my window. I had started rising before dawn, savoring the quiet moments before the city woke. That early stillness reminded me that peace isn't found, it's built, brick by brick, in the decisions we dare to make. One of those mornings, while sipping my coffee, I thought about writing again, really writing. Not just in my journal, but something more lasting. The idea had been blooming in me for months, like a whisper I kept ignoring. Now it was loud and clear. I wanted to write a book. Not a manual, not advice, just my truth. A story about a woman who chose herself when everyone else stopped choosing her. I told Henry about it later that day as we sat on a park bench watching ducks glide across the pond. He looked at me with that thoughtful smile of his. "You should," he said simply. "There are women who need your story to breathe again. But what if it hurts too much to revisit?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Then right through the hurt. Pain has a way of turning into poetry when you give it a voice." So I began. Every morning after my walk, I'd sit at my desk and write for hours. The words came like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. I didn't censor myself. I wrote about love and disappointment, about motherhood and loneliness, about courage disguised as surrender. Marilyn would peek into my room every now and then. "You look like a woman possessed," she teased. "I guess I am," I said. "Possessed by my own truth," she grinned. "It's about time." By midsummer, I had over 200 pages, a raw, imperfect reflection of a lifetime. I titled it, "Leaving to Live." It felt fitting. When I handed the first printed copy to Henry, he held it as though it were something sacred. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "You've turned your pain into a lighthouse." His words made my throat tighten. For years, I had believed my life was nothing but wasted effort and forgotten sacrifices. Now, seeing my story on paper, I realized that everything I had endured had led me here, to this peace, this clarity, this freedom. The local library hosted small author nights, and Nora, ever the encourager, insisted I sign up. "People need to hear it in your voice," she said. "They need to see that it's possible." So one evening in July, I found myself standing before a modest crowd, reading excerpts from my book. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. The audience listened in stillness, some nodding, others wiping tears. When I finished, there was a pause, a breath of silence, before the applause began. Afterward, a woman approached me, maybe in her 50s, her eyes shining with emotion. "I thought it was too late for me," she said, clutching my hand. "But now I know it's not." That night, when I got home, I sat on the porch with Marilyn and told her everything. She smiled quietly, her eyes glistening. "You've done what few people ever do, Cecilia. You've healed and shared the map." A few days later, an email arrived from a small publishing house in Austin. They had heard about my reading and wanted to discuss publishing Leaving to Live formally. I almost didn't believe it at first, but Henry convinced me to take the meeting. "You've spent your life nurturing everyone else," he said. "Let the world nurture your words now." I traveled to Austin with him and Marilyn. The meeting went better than I could have imagined. They wanted minimal edits and even offered to include an author's note about late-life reinvention. On the train ride back, I stared out the window, watching the Texas plains roll by, and whispered to myself, "It's never too late to begin again." When the first printed edition arrived 2 months later, I held it to my chest and cried. Not from sadness, but from recognition. I had written myself home. Life after that took on a gentler rhythm. The book brought me invitations to small events and letters from readers. Some thanked me for giving them courage. Others simply said they saw themselves in my story. Each word from them felt like a hand reaching back through time to comfort the woman I once was. Henry became my closest companion through it all. We spent long afternoons walking, laughing, and sometimes just sitting in silence. There was an ease between us that needed no promises. Once, as we watched the sunset paint the sky in orange and violet, he turned to me and said, "If I'd met you 20 years ago, I think I would have fallen in love with you." I smiled, feeling warmth spread through me. "And if I'd met you 20 years ago," I said, "I wouldn't have been ready." He chuckled. "So maybe this is exactly when it was meant to happen. We didn't need to label it." Companionship was enough. After a lifetime of giving everything away, learning to receive even simple affection felt like grace. One afternoon, months later, I received another letter. This one wasn't from my publisher or readers, it was from Daniel. "Mom, I saw your book. I read it cover to cover. I cried. I finally understand what you were trying to tell us all those years without saying a word. I showed it to Dad before he passed last month. He said he was proud of you. So am I. I'm sorry, not because I lost you, but because I didn't see you. I do now. Thank you for teaching me what freedom looks like. Love, Daniel." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the first page of my book. That night, I sat under the stars with Henry and read it aloud to him. When I finished, he squeezed my hand gently. "They finally see you," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "But the best part is, I see myself too." The next morning, I visited the park alone. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the air smelled of wet earth and blooming magnolias. I sat on my favorite bench, the same one where I had once cried quietly after leaving the hospital. Only this time I smiled. I had found peace not in forgiveness from others, but in the courage to forgive myself for staying too long, for loving too hard, for forgetting who I was. As I stood to leave, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from children nearby. It reminded me that life, no matter how fractured, always finds its way back to joy. I walked home slowly, the world around me radiant and alive. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward everything. The day my book officially launched felt like standing inside a dream I'd written for someone else. The small bookstore downtown was filled with people, faces familiar and unfamiliar, all gathered to listen, to celebrate, to bear witness. Nora stood near the back, her eyes bright with pride, while Marilyn fussed near the snack table, arranging pastries as if the fate of the evening depended on symmetry. Henry stood beside me, steady as ever. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. As I'll ever be. When I stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. I looked out over the crowd, took a deep breath, and smiled. "Thank you for coming," I began. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of every woman who's ever had to learn how to live after being forgotten." As I read passages from Leaving to Live, the words felt new again, reshaped by the emotion in the room. I saw tears glinting in the audience, soft smiles, hands clasped together. I realized that the book no longer belonged to me. It belonged to anyone who had ever needed it. After the reading, people came forward with hugs, questions, and stories of their own. A young man told me his mother had left home the year before and that reading my story helped him understand her choice. A woman in her 70s said she was finally ready to forgive herself for a life she once called wasted. I listened, each story threading itself into mine. It was as though every broken piece of me had become a mirror for someone else's healing. When the crowd thinned and the evening waned, I found myself standing by the display window, the city lights glowing against the glass. Henry joined me, holding 2 cups of tea from the cafe next door. "You did it," he said. I turned to him, smiling softly. "We did it. You believed when I couldn't," he shook his head. "No, Cecilia. You were always capable. You just needed to remember. We stayed until the store closed, helping Nora clean up. As I packed away the leftover books, I felt a deep calm settle over me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't searching for meaning. I was living it. That night, when we returned to Marilyn's house, she hugged me tight. "You've changed so many lives, my dear," she said. "Even your own." Her words stayed with me as I went to bed. The moonlight spilled across my room, painting everything silver. I thought of the girl I once was, the one who waited by the phone, who mistook silence for love. I wished I could reach back through time, hold her hand and whisper, "You'll make it out. You'll find your way." In the weeks that followed, letters continued to arrive, some from across the country, others from women in faraway places who had somehow found my book. They spoke of courage, of heartbreak, of rediscovery. Each one felt like an echo returning home. Then one afternoon, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a framed photo of my sons, Michael and Daniel, standing together on a beach. They looked older but peaceful. Beneath the photo was a note written in Daniel's handwriting. "For Mom, thank you for teaching us that love doesn't vanish just because it changes shape. We'd like to see you if you're willing. No pressure, no expectations, just together." I sat there for a long time, tracing the edge of the frame with my fingers. My first instinct was fear, the fear of reopening old wounds, of facing what I had spent so long healing from. But then I thought of what I had written. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is say yes to the unknown. So I said yes. 2 weeks later, I met them at a small cafe near the coast, halfway between our worlds. When I walked in, they both stood. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was thick, but not heavy. It was the silence of recognition, of hearts slowly finding their rhythm again. Michael was the first to step forward. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Hi," I replied, my own voice catching. Then Daniel came closer, his eyes wet. "You look good." "So do you," I said, smiling through tears. We sat together for hours, talking, laughing, crying. They told me about their lives, their regrets, their new beginnings. I told them about Marilyn, Henry, and my writing. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. There was no grand reconciliation, no movie-worthy moment of redemption, just understanding, tender and real. When we finally said goodbye, Daniel hugged me tightly and whispered, "Don't disappear again." "I won't," I promised. "But remember, I'm not the same woman I was." "I live for me now," he smiled. "That's all we ever wanted for you, even if we didn't know it." As I drove back home, the sunset spread across the horizon like a painting, fiery orange fading into gold. I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush through my hair, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely whole. When I got home, Henry was waiting on the porch. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than I expected," I said. "Not perfect, but good," he nodded knowingly. "Good is enough." We sat together in the growing twilight, and I realized that life rarely gives us clean endings. It gives us moments, fragile, beautiful, and fleeting, and it's up to us to gather them into something that feels like peace. As the stars began to bloom across the sky, I whispered, "I think I finally understand what freedom means." Henry turned to me, his expression gentle. "Tell me." "It's not about running away," I said. "It's about coming home to yourself and staying there," he smiled. "Then you've made it." I leaned back, letting the quiet settle around us. The world no longer felt like a place I needed to escape. It was mine again, every morning breeze, every page unwritten, every step yet to take. Later that night, as I closed my journal for the last time, I wrote one final line beneath all the others. I left to live. And in living, I found myself, and with that, I turned off the light, the moon spilling softly through the window, and drifted to sleep with a heart finally, irrevocably at peace.